This is Gareth Southgate, and this is the Three Lions podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Three Lions podcast. My name is Russell Osborne and this is an independent England football supporters podcast. I hope you're keeping well. Been really nice to receive some great messages of late about the podcast. Or whilst I was in Macedonia, a couple of people said that they enjoyed listening to it. Very kind of you to say so and very much appreciated. If you'd like to get in touch or just want to reach out and say hi, please don't hesitate. You can do it all on social media. The podcast is there, Twitter, Facebook, Threads, Instagram, or you can send me an email, threelionspodcast@gmail.com. And it's on YouTube too. If you've got any ideas for the show or would like to contribute maybe to the Your England Journey series, don't be shy. I'm all ears. Now, this is an episode that I'm hoping you'll not only enjoy, but find educational too. With no further ado, this is my chat with Matt Tiller. He has written a book about Jack Leslie. A name may ring a bell, or perhaps it doesn't. Listen and learn. Now, over the years, England have been involved in many controversial stories, both on and off the pitch. Some we know about, some that are resolved, some we're still learning about. But one in recent years has come to light, and it's a story that's now able to be told. It's my pleasure to welcome to the Three Lions podcast, author of the book, The Lion Who Never Roared, Jack Leslie, the star robbed of England glory. Welcome along, Plymouth Argyle and England fan, Matt Tiller. Hello, Matt.
Hi, Russell. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you for coming on board.
Not at all.
What an interesting story this is.
Yeah, it's a hell of a story. I mean, it's, as a Plymouth Argyle fan, when Jack Leslie's in the record books, but then it was only a few years ago that I really found out about the England story. And at first I was like, this can't be right. It's got to be sort of blown up out of all proportion. I learned the story in a bar when I met another Argyle fan. You always end up getting introduced, and he started telling me, he was an older guy than me, and started telling me the story. I thought, well, I'm going to have to, check this out. And as soon as I got home, started Googling. I was like, oh, this really is true. And the more that I read, there was, lots of actual proper articles online from academics and stuff, and times over the years when it has been mentioned, but it's kind of sort of risen to the surface briefly and then kind of, disappeared again. And it's true. Jack Leslie was the first black player to be selected for England in 1925.
Well, I think I first heard of the story possibly shortly after yourself. I think it was like a news article, a BBC news article. And I seem to remember hearing it then and thinking, oh, that's interesting. I ought to dig a bit deeper. And to be honest, I didn't. And it was only a couple of England programmes, matchday programmes back, and I've been back through them. There was one in a Ukraine one in March, and then there was one in Italy in October, which sort of nicely rounds it up.
Yes.
But it was only then that I thought, actually, I remember this story. And it's nice to be able to see how it's all evolved in your book. And first of all, I want to say, not only is it an enjoyable read, but it's an educational read too. It's really good. So congratulations on it.
Thank you. It's been an amazing thing to do. Obviously, I've been involved in setting up the campaign, but it's made me think more deeply about what happened to Jack, and it's just been a real privilege.
Well, perhaps just introduce yourself, and then take us, like you've mentioned about meeting up in the pub and
Yes,
sort of encountering this story, but where did it go from there?
Well, I mean, I've been a Plymouth Argyle fan since the mid '80s. I ended up in Plymouth when I was about 4. My dad was in the army, and they were not really a football family, so it was a bit later that school friends started sort of taking me along to Argyle, and since then we had this big cup run in '84. I was too young; my parents wouldn't allow me to go to the semi-final against Watford, where I'd have seen John Barnes play against play for Watford against Argyle, and it was a narrow win for them, but there was a huge buzz in the city, and then I started going, and we were pretty good in the '80s, up and down in the '90s. But yeah, I've been an Argyle fan ever since, and I go whenever I can. I'm based in London, so I go to away games, and yeah, once I sort of heard the story through this guy that I was introduced to, Tony Fitzgerald, I then started telling my mates, who were all, a lot of them are Argyle fans, and when I was chatting to my friend Greg Foxsmith, who is chair of the London supporters group for Argyle, he was just like, we've got to do something about this. And he's a real sort of campaigning lawyer. And so we just kind of had fire in our bellies, really, and started talking to people about it. And yeah, everything was a bit crazy in 2020 when we launched. We were about to launch, and then COVID hit. We thought, well, this is it. It'll all have to go on hold now. There's no football. We're not going to be able to raise any money. And then murder of George Floyd, the Colston statue came down in Bristol, and we had a website up, and suddenly we got a load of attention. And the BBC News, Greg had a contact, and he wanted to do the story, and we were just talking to each other and said, we're never going to get this opportunity again. They wanted to tell the story on the national news for the BBC, and so we just went for it, and it got picked up everywhere. And yeah, we managed to raise £100,000 or more than that in 6 weeks, to build a statue of Jack outside Home Park. So it was immense. It was, insane. It was just one of the best things that we've done. And amazingly, Greg and I are still talking to each other and still going to Argyle matches.
Oh, amazing. I mean, all of that's happened within the space of 4 and a bit years.
Yeah, not even that. I mean, it's at 2019 that we first started talking about it, and then talking to Argyle, and we've got fantastic new owner, Simon Hallett, and he was already on board with celebrating Jack, because they were, we spoke to him and he said, can you just hang on a moment, because we're about to name the boardroom in the new grandstand after him. And we were sort of respected that, because we didn't want to make it look like we were putting pressure on him to do that, because it was already, they were already planning to do that. So,
yeah.
So we that happened, and the club has embraced it, and even when the statue was unveiled a year ago, things still, have moved on in an amazing way, because the England recognition, obviously the statue unveiling for us Argyle fans and for the whole football community, but for Jack's family, he has 3 granddaughters still with us, and for them, the story had kind of, they knew it, but said whenever they talked to people about it, people would kind of just glaze over and say that's not true. And having this recognition has been massive for them. And then when the FA, who had effectively denied it for nearly a century, actually changed their mind and said, and this was before the England Nations League game against Germany in September last year, Debbie Hewitt said Jack Leslie was the first black player to be selected for England. And up to that point, they'd just denied that fact. Even though, when we started the campaign, they supported us financially and said, a sort of vague but nice quote. We asked, would you give Jack an honorary cap? And it was a flat no. But then when we were able to speak to Debbie Hewitt, who'd come in after Greg Clark's ignominious demise. She actually read. I'd done a lot of research with other people's help who'd already looked into the story, and she read it. She actually took the time to read. Sort of, it's a long article on our website, and then rang us up within days and said, "I'm going to try and do something about this." And she did. Within a few weeks, she got the go ahead to award Jack the posthumous honorary England cap, which was then presented ahead of that Ukraine game that you mentioned.
That's right. I remember it now. Yeah. No, bravo, Debbie, I think. Really?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And, lots of other people helped. Paul Elliott, who was there at that September game, legend. And, someone who followed in Jack's footsteps as a pioneering black footballer. That was an immense moment.
Good stuff. Well, let's find out a little bit more out about Jack. Obviously, love people to go and buy the book and find it all out about themselves. So I don't want to give too much away. A few teasers.
Yes.
But Jack was, born 1901. So getting some information on him must have been quite tough.
The early years were quite tough. The three granddaughters were amazing. I started, I'd already done a bit of research for that article that I mentioned that Debbie read. So I knew a fair amount about the England story, but what I needed because of COVID, we'd not really been able to meet up. So I went and spent a couple of days with them, went through their folder of photos and the few remaining bits of memorabilia. There's a few medals, but, not enough. As you'll know from reading, he gave a lot of, he gave a lot of them away. So they told me, the story about Jack's dad running away from Jamaica at the age of 12, which was pretty incredible, not uncommon actually. And settling, in the end, here in London and marrying a white woman from Islington, and they settled in the East End. And that's where Jack was born, in Canning Town in 1901, as you said. And so we knew little bits, but it's amazing what tiny things kind of came to light. Even as I was sort of reaching my deadline, we were sent a letter by a journalist in Australia who was, I think, the great grandson of Bob Jack, the Plymouth manager, and his grandson had been a journalist, and then it's quite a family. Anyway, he'd been sent this letter dated the 80s, and it was from a school friend of Jack's who said he'd seen an article about black footballers that mentioned Jack Leslie, and said, I was at school with Jack, and he'd written down all this information about how he'd won the London School Swimming Championship at the age of 14, and how they'd formed their own team because they used to play youth football for this sort of charitable organisation. And there's a bit of evidence there about that, but this is the first time I'd seen this. They played this in their own. They formed their own team, played in a league, set it all up themselves. They obviously thought they were too good for. Jack was clearly a phenomenally talented player.
Yeah.
Reached some final that they played at Upton Park. It was the first time I knew that. So he played at Upton Park as a teenager. So that was amazing. But yeah, there was scant evidence, but I just had to kind of piece it all together. But then as we get into his football career, there's obviously, there's loads of cuttings that I was able to find.
Yeah. I don't know if we've got any Barking Town supporters who listen to the podcast, but hello to any Barking Town fans. And they will know of Jack.
Oh yeah, they're now a Barking Town when Jack played for them, Barking FC now, and they're a great club. They were a brilliant, and because there's I wouldn't like to describe them as a small club, because they're not that, but compared to obviously Plymouth or West Ham. But they really got on board with Jack's story and really embraced him and helped fundraise. And they're a great club. And Jack was signed for them. They're an amateur non-league side, signed in 1919 after the First World War. And so Jack was playing on the left wing for Barking Town and was, winning plaudits. And I mean, it was quite crazy. They were playing in front of sort of 5, 6, 7, 8,000 people.
Yeah.
And even in 1919, Jack, this was in his first months as a player at that level, was sort of selected to represent a London League side and was off playing in France in a tour that was organised by Jules Rimet.
I know, amazing.
We'll all recognise that name. If you follow international football, follow England. Nuts. What a time to be. I mean, it was just after the First World War, going off to France and playing football. He did another tour representing Essex. And some of the photos that are in the book are, they're really kind of moving and evocative of that time, I think.
Yeah. Well, he was banging the goals in for Barking and being the star there in that league. And there was the word that the likes of Tottenham, Chelsea, West Ham, Fulham and Portsmouth too were all sort of sniffing around, as it were. He obviously didn't go there, but he was enticed down to Plymouth by the strangest of ways, wasn't he?
Yeah, you do sort of wonder. Everyone thinks, if he was so good, why did he play for Plymouth? Which is, obviously I find that hurtful as an Argyle fan, but it's a fair question to ask. But the Plymouth manager came and watched Barking play Dulwich Hamlet, and in a cup final that 15,000 people attended in 1921 at the Old Den. And he went to Jack's house and showed him and his parents postcards of a sunny Plymouth seafront. Now, that's where I grew up. And if you've been to watch Plymouth at Home Park, it's very rarely sunny. It rains a lot. But Jack told the story a couple of times, but particularly in an interview with the Daily Mail in 1978, which coincided with Viv Anderson's sort of groundbreaking selection. Yes. And he said, his parents' eyes popped out, and they because he'd learned his trade. He was a boiler maker and had been an apprentice while playing for Barking. They were happy for him to pursue his dream and thought that this would be an amazing opportunity. And apparently Plymouth even offered more money than those other clubs, right. Which, they were really trying then to get, they had a sort of a burgeoning team of stars. They were trying to make it up the ladder. They had a huge array of either sort of former or future England internationals. It was quite a crazy time. And so for Jack, it was an adventure. And he wouldn't have been on the maximum wage at the time as a young player, but Plymouth obviously offered more than the other clubs. And he thought, well, I'll go. And that's where his professional football career took off.
That's right. And I mean, Plymouth then was it third division south? How the football structure was back then. So they weren't Premier League equivalent these days.
No.
So it's still quite a move though, especially in distance between Canning Town and Plymouth. So it was always going to be a new journey for him and a lot of going backwards and forwards on overnight trains as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. You talk about overnight trains. So that's our record defeat against Everton was. You look at it in the stats in the record books and go, oh, that's pretty shameful, losing I think it was 9-1 at Everton. But the team had played the day before and then travelled overnight. So that's getting the excuses in. It was a very different time. And they would be, spending hours and hours on trains. But I think Jack had obviously had, he was a London boy, but he had a sort of sense of adventure, just like his dad did, and to run away from Jamaica. And I think, he embraced that and loved being a part of the Plymouth setup, which was, they had Bob Jack's son, David. He ended up playing many times and I think captaining England. He scored at that first Wembley Cup final in 1923. He'd left Plymouth and was at Bolton. So it was quite a time at Plymouth.
He went on to sort of stake his claim in the Plymouth team, and without wanting to, I don't know, belittle Plymouth in any way or sort of drive the knife in. It was,
no, come on, bring it on.
continuously missing out on promotion by the slightest of whiskers for, what was it, 5 or 6 seasons in a row.
It was 6 seasons in a row. Argyle finished runners-up, and in the 3rd Division South in the 1920s, that meant you got nothing. Only the champions, because you had 3rd Division South and North, and one team would go up from each would go up into the 2nd Division, 2 would go down from the 2nd,
yes,
and then we were, one of the best teams around, but narrowly missing out on so many occasions, it would have been incredibly frustrating. Also for Plymouth as a team, because that meant they were paying out more in win bonuses. Jack was probably earning more than if he'd been in a higher division, because we won so many games without moving up that and Argyle, they did have financial problems later in the decade. Obviously it was a tough time financially for the country generally, but they had some tough times, then. I think that was part of the reason.
Yeah. Well, 1924, whilst Jack was sort of a mainstay as part of that team, there's a chapter in the book about a tour of South America, which is fascinating. And whilst I don't want to give too much away about it, to say he made an impression there, and I think maybe that leading into 1925 when he became married to Win. Things were then beginning to be on the reel up for him, and that's sort of where the story really comes into itself, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that South America tour is amazing. So it's remarkable when I found out about that, and that he was getting plaudits internationally, and that's where he really established himself. And like I said, he started at Barking on the left wing, and that's how he came to Plymouth. And there was an experienced left winger that he was basically understudy to, but Bob Jack, the manager, spotted that maybe he should move him inside and effectively become, a number 10, an attacking midfielder. Obviously the formations were different then, but Jack could score and create goals. And he was bulking up, and he established himself on that South America tour, played the next season, I think was top scorer. And going into 1925 was one of the first on the team sheet. And, he'd also been joined by this incredible Scottish winger, Sammy Black, and the two of them were written about across the country. The pair of them really were nationally famous. They were, if you were a football fan, you would know Jack Leslie and Sammy Black in the 20s and 30s. And at the start of 1925, goals were flying in everywhere because there was a change to the offside rule, but Argyle were particularly on fire, and they were getting recognition for that. Jack's pictured scoring on the opening day of the season, and so it's an amazing picture that's in the book, and it's on the plinth of the statue, and that actually inspired the pose for the statue. It's Jack wheeling away in celebration. That moment when a striker knows the ball is going in the back of the net, and that picture's in the Daily Mirror in August 1925, and it was the next month that the FA were looking for. They put a call out for players, for recommendations for potential England players, and Jack's name was put forward. And on the 5th of
would it have been put forward by the Plymouth manager, Bob Jack?
I mean, I think it probably would. We don't know that for sure. There's but what we do know is that the FA put that call out and asked for recommendations, and Bob Jack was a really well connected football man, and we know that Jack was selected at the 5th of October meeting. So, I'm sure that he would have been one of the people that would have recommended him. But Jack was actually this is, we can't go into all of this but a lot of people are so, surely the selectors must have known that he was black if he was that. Well, yes, I think they would have done. Certainly many of them, because, he was in the papers from this time at Barking. Some of the selectors would have seen him play without a doubt. And I believe they selected him on merit. And Bob Jack, like I say, well connected. There were lots of connections between the FA and Plymouth, as there would be with every football club. But Argyle had players who had played for England, had players who had been selected for England while at Argyle. There's some really interesting connections that you should look at in the book. But he was on the 5th of October. The selectors met to choose the team to play against Ireland in Belfast later that month. And the next day, Jack's name was printed in the team that was published across the country, in newspapers across the country. And he was named as one of the 2 reserves to travel. What that meant, that was 13 players who were picked for England for that game. And that was absolutely massive news in Plymouth. And Bob Jack, the manager, was the one that gave him the news. And
I kind of got the impression reading it, he felt so proud being able to give Jack Leslie that news. He kind of taken him under his wing, hadn't he? And that's brought to Plymouth. Yeah. And he must have had a big smile. That must have been a nice meeting.
It makes what followed all the more shattering, because Bob Jack had some of the other players that he brought in from Barking. The other 2 players he signed in 1921 had gone on. They'd been moved on. But it's clear that Bob Jack felt he had a really special young talent, because although Jack didn't break into the first team on a regular basis for a few years, you just get that sense that he knew he was good. And from some of the comments that he makes throughout his career, always backing him, he was like if you're a sort of Fergie figure to, as Fergie was to his players, to Bob Jack was to Jack Leslie. And so, and also the managers, they're busy people. So for Bob Jack to call Jack Leslie into his office, Jack would have probably been thinking, oh, well, what's going on? It's just like just turning up for training. And then to be given that news, it would have been immense. And then the banter in the dressing room, you can just imagine it, because, in that dressing room, you had a guy called Jack Cock who had played for England and at that point had scored the fastest goal for England after, I think it was 19 seconds. So you had these, and he was a real character as well. And it's only when I was sort of writing the book that, although I knew the story and thought this is a terrible thing, what happened, it's only really when I thought about all those kind of footballing connections that we always do. We always hear the commentators say, oh, so-and-so played for them and it's revenge, or there's this connection or that. It's only when writing all this down and finding some of these other little bits out, these little footballing connections, that it made me feel more deeply what had happened to Jack. So once he'd got that incredible news, for it then to just go silent, and for people like Bob Jack not be able to tell him the reason, to not be able to look him in the eye, was really heartbreaking.
Because it went on for quite some time. As you say, it was announced, as it were, back on the 6th of October of that year, 1925.
Yeah.
But it was almost 2 weeks later, on the 19th of October, when the Athletic News of the time, sort of, they printed a story that all of a sudden didn't include Jack.
Yeah, they printed the team. The FA International Selection Committee, they met a second time on the 19th of October, and they had some issues to deal with. They had injuries, and but Jack wasn't injured. He wasn't suspended, but his name was, there had been speculation that Jack might step into the starting lineup given those injuries. And but no, on the 19th he was scrubbed off the team sheet. And yeah, I mean, let's see, looked at the minutes from the 5th of October are signed off on the 19th, and that new team is issued on the 19th. And yeah, it's published in the Athletic News, and then subsequently as the game approaches, and no one tells Jack. No one lets him. No one says, "Oh, we've changed our mind." You know, no one gets in touch to say you don't need to pack your bags to travel to Ireland. So he's wondering what's going on, and he said it himself in this interview in 1978 that he did ask. So you can imagine the awkwardness of those conversations.
Yeah.
And people not being able to say, and he said he heard. So the FA come to have a second look at him. It's when you think about that, just being given that incredible news, and for it all to go quiet. I mean, what a way to treat a talented young man.
It's unbelievable, really. The game against Ireland, England drew 0-0. Yeah, what I find crazy at the same time, I know it obviously happens with lower league sides playing on days where England play, but Plymouth played that same day whilst England were away in Belfast. Plymouth played Bournemouth and Boscombe Athletic, 1-7-2.
Yeah,
Jack scored twice that day as well, didn't he?
Well, he bounced back in the only way that he could. You know,
Absolutely.
He couldn't complain. He couldn't, he couldn't cause a social media storm. But what he could do was score goals and show people what he could do, and that's what he continued to do, because his career went from strength to strength. He was only really at the start of it. He was, he'd seen other players who'd been picked as reserves to travel while at Argyle, and seen them progress into the England team. And for Jack, that opportunity had been snuffed out. And it was written about many times afterwards that that here is one of, if not the best inside lefts in the country, and he went on to score 137 goals for Argyle in 400 games. So he stamped his mark on the history of the game, despite that England shame.
And with Argyle, as you say, scored all those goals. And finally, come 1930, the dream was achieved, where promotion was achieved.
Finally, yeah, at the end of that tortuous decade. What a moment that must have been. Finally, I mean, really, they should have been up there, many years before. Because I think that's where it sort of tipped over. They obviously got promoted. They managed to survive the following season. Jack actually became captain, and I think that's a remarkable achievement in itself. He was a hero in Plymouth. That's not to say that there weren't struggles. I think you'd be in denial to think that he didn't face any abuse or discrimination, because he would have done. But he wasn't the kind of man to ever make a big deal of it, just as he never did about what happened to him with England. But I certainly think it hurt, and continued to do so. But yeah, he became the first black captain of a Football League side, which I think is a remarkable achievement in itself. Helped save us from relegation in that first year, that tough year when you've just been promoted, which Argyle fans can relate to right now. Although it's going okay, it's a bit twitchy. And then the following season, with Jack fully in charge, we reached our highest league position ever, fourth in the second division, which again, no playoffs. We've only matched that once since. And but yeah, a hell of a career for Argyle.
Yeah. He had an unfortunate end to his career, didn't he? His footballing career, which when I read about it, I thought, oh dear, this is painful. But at the same time, I think, well, probably actually happened on maybe a semi-regular occurrence for players, didn't it?
Yeah. He was leaping to head the ball. He was a brave, courageous player. And, these old heavy leather balls that would get sodden and even weightier when it was wet. He leapt to make a header, and the lace of this ball had come loose and scraped across his eye. And I think at first they didn't think it was too bad, but then as the sort of days progressed, Jack's having to go into the eye infirmary, and there was a fear that he was going to lose his sight. And he was in and out of hospital for a year. Mm-hmm. And he was given this sort of positive report by his doctor, and Argyle sort of signed him back up for another season. But it was still December 1934 before he came back into the first team. And what I think shows what he was like as a player, that his final goal for Argyle against Fulham was a diving header, and there's a picture of throwing himself at the ball despite that injury. But it's clear though that he wasn't the same player. His vision was just slightly impaired. His granddaughters say that he couldn't look into the sun. So if you're playing into the sun, it would affect him massively. Which
right,
as a forward, that's it's going to be difficult in any position. Let's face it. You want to leap up and head the ball, and you're totally blinded. So yeah, that was the end.
Unfortunate way for a career to end. But it wasn't to be the end of his football involvement. No. Although he would have a couple of other sort of jobs between football, shall we say?
Yeah, he ran a pub in Truro for a few years. That didn't go well. There's quite a funny chapter in the book. I think a lot of footballers, some of his mates had run pubs. One of his best mates, Fred Titmus, who'd played for England before coming to Argyle, he ran a couple of pubs and continued. But Jack and his wife, I think his wife probably thought it'd be a good idea to not run the business into a ground and maybe return back to East London. And Jack loved his roots as well. He went back, and perfect timing just before the outbreak of the Second World War. Let's go from Cornwall to the East End. And he worked in the docks, East India docks, as a boiler maker. That was his trade. And I mean, that must have been pretty horrendous. And there's a few sort of stories that have been passed down from those years. And he still loved football. He did a bit of scouting for Argyle, and he went back there in the 60s as a guest of honour. And apparently he got really emotional because he thought they'd all have forgotten him, but the fans gave him a standing ovation, because of course many of them would have seen him play. Those those older fans would have passed on stories of Jack.
Yeah,
and they remembered the England story. They really did. I've become friends with a 97-year-old fan who started seeing Argyle in the early 30s, so but just saw Jack play, and it stuck with him. And he retired as a boilermaker in 65 or 66, and apparently he was getting a bit bored in his retirement, maybe getting under everyone's feet. They all lived in the same house in East Ham. He went back to East London, and his daughter and husband moved in, and they had three daughters, who Lynn, Leslie, and Jill, who we've got to know really well, myself and Greg, my fellow campaigner, and they all lived there. And it was his daughter Evelyn who said, maybe you should go and knock on Ron Greenwood's door at Upton Park and have a chat and see if there's anything going. And so he went, and Ron, apparently was aware of Jack's prowess as a player and his football connections, and gave him a job in the boot room. And it is a sort of slightly bittersweet ending when you think, if you just sort of read it, he had this great footballing career, was denied by England, and then goes to West Ham and is cleaning the boots of Bobby Moore, Jeff Hurst, and Martin Peters. And it is bittersweet, but he worked at West Ham for 15 years and absolutely loved it. It gave him a new lease of life. He was in the football club, and obviously kept him, that's pretty remarkable, working there till he was 81.
Yeah. And in that time, he would have seen Viv Anderson, who was a player for for Nottingham Forest at the time, 1978. He would go on to take the pitch for England and become that first black player for England. I mean, what would Jack what would have gone through his mind, do you think?
Well, we have a little bit of evidence for his thoughts, because it was actually just after that selection that the Daily Mail interviewed him, and apparently it was the granddaughters tell me it was a woman from Devon, an Argyle fan, who wrote to the Mail and said, "Oh, Viv Anderson wasn't the first to be selected; it was our Jack Leslie." Right. And of course, Jack was working at West Ham, so it was easy to track down.
Yes,
and he never, like I say, never really kind of spoke about it. Some people knew about the story because that it had been passed down over the years, but he never sort of boasted about his prowess or complained about what happened to him. But when the Daily Mail interviewed him, he just told it like it was. And he was really pleased for Viv Anderson and the other players, those that were coming through at West Ham, who, we all know what the terraces were like and how rife racism was across many, if not all clubs, including West Ham. But West Ham also brought through many black players like, Addy Coker and John and Clyde Charles, Clyde Best, of course, who remembered Jack very fondly. And Trevor Brooking talked a bit about this, who remembered Jack as a great mate, but Jack never really talked about his football career, and certainly not the England. So Trevor Brooking was shocked to hear it, but had really fond memories of Jack, and said when Viv Anderson was selected, it must have brought it all back up for Jack. That feeling that what might have been, and the fact that Jack said it himself in that interview. He wasn't a boasting man, but he said, "I was good enough," and he knew that he was. But he was pleased. There's no sort of bitterness against those who were coming through. He was pleased that those players were getting the opportunity that he didn't get. And he said that there's a short interview in a book by the journalist Brian Wilno. So it's moving to read that, but it's also, it does make you think that it must have stuck with him, and it certainly did with the family. His daughter was really angry about what happened to him, and like I say, the granddaughters have been, it doesn't change what happened, but the recognition has made a really positive impact for them.
Yeah, I can well imagine. And the book, Viv Anderson has actually done the foreword for it. He's speaking with him.
He's been a supporter from the start. In that first BBC report, they interviewed Viv Anderson. It made sense, and Viv was, surprised that he hadn't heard the story of Jack Leslie before, and felt that those players from the past should be celebrated, and because it can have a positive impact today to know our history. And that was quite mind blowing because I'm old enough to just about remember, vaguely remember that moment, but certainly be very aware of Viv Anderson as a player when I was a kid, and playing for England, and after 78 when he was selected, and be aware of what was going on the terraces at the time. So to hear, I got to meet him and do a little interview at the start of the campaign, and then he's contributed to this. It's because he's such a key part of the story, part of our football history, and also a key part of the story, because without his selection, Jack's story wouldn't have got that attention, and we'd have very little evidence from his own mouth, which we have through that interview, which is, when you read it, I've read it in full several times now, and it always brings a lump in my throat.
Yeah. Well, take us back to Home Park, and the statue, which you described at the beginning of the chat, and there's pictures within the book of what it looks like. How did a statue like that come about?
Well, we decided that's what we were going to do, that we felt that it would be it would be a really positive thing to celebrate someone who not only was a Plymouth Argyle legend, but a bona fide legend, who the kind of club legend that deserves a statue in any case, but also the significance of his story means it's a story that should be told more widely, and this monument could do that. And that was always our aim. So the fact that we broke through our target and raised more money meant that we were able to be more ambitious with what we could do. And we went through an exhaustive process, Greg, myself, the granddaughters, and committee of supporters who helped in that, and narrowed it down, did interviews, and we chose Andy Edwards, who is a phenomenal sculptor. He's done many football statues and others. And he just kind of got what we were doing and really threw himself into it, not just in terms of creating a good statue. He came up with that pose. Okay. But that was done through conversations with us, and particularly the granddaughters, and looking at all their photos and having all those conversations and with us. And he really helped with all the kind of their storytelling on the plinth with photos etched in granite. So that photo of the wheeling away goal scoring in 1925, a picture from the boot room, and a picture of Jack and Sammy Black, who I always want to talk about as part of the story because they were such a partnership and stayed friends. And we just set to work, and it took some time, but it was worth spending that time, because the moment when the granddaughters visited Andy Edwards' studio for the first time, and the One Show filmed it, and it was, they were walking through the door to see what Andy had done. It was still the work in progress, but we had the pose and his features, and, they immediately welled up, and it was a very emotional moment. And one of great relief for us. It's quite a responsibility, and for Andy.
Yeah, very much.
And we thought it looked great, but obviously it had to be their granddad. And, it was, we're all really pleased with the statue and the feedback, the reaction that people have. Whenever I've been, to a home game, I'll head down and hang out a bit before, and always, if there's anyone that isn't sure about the story, I will tell it to them. It's been great. People, away fans, come and get pictures as well. It's it's a wonderful thing. Great.
It's been a long time since I've been to Plymouth, I have to be honest. But when I next get down there, it's certainly somewhere where I shall direct myself to go and see it in the flesh, as it were.
Yes, definitely should.
Well, Jack unfortunately passed away on the 25th of November, 1988. But the story lives on within the book, within the website as well. There's a lot more information on there. It's jackleslie.co.uk, I believe.
That's right. We've always tried to sort of, maintain and update it. And because it just keeps rolling on with the, I thought with the statue unveiling last October, that would kind of not exactly be it, but it's great when, schools get in touch and want us to go and speak. We spoke to academies in Plymouth and West Ham. And it's great in engaging young people in the story. So we keep that updated as much as we can and on social media. And, have a look at jackleslie.co.uk. There's, lots of stuff on there.
The book is called The Lion Who Never Roared, Jack Leslie, the Star Robbed of England Glory. There was just one thing at the very beginning of the book I wanted to mention, in the introduction. It says, "We're late in telling these stories, but at least they're being told. It's never too late," which I think is a great way for all of us to sort of look back on history and these things.
I think so. I think, I never want to, and Greg and I and people who've been involved in the campaign, you never want to say unequivocally, isn't this brilliant that this is happening now? Because it is, but I always have that feeling that I wish I'd known that story when I was growing up in Plymouth and going to watch Argyle. And when I started to see black players come into the Argyle team, like, legend of ours, Ronnie Mojay, who's our only player to ever score at Wembley, despite the fact that I've seen him play at Wembley 3 times. But I was there the day that he scored, and it was a playoff final in '96, and it was amazing. But he came from London down to Plymouth and was embraced as a legend. But he did say what a difference it would have made had he known Jack's story, to know that there was that legacy there, and it wasn't celebrated back then. And so, it's great to have those celebrations, but it's important to remember what that journey was and what he, you can never understand what he went through entirely, but to have some, just reflect on that, I think. Yeah. But yes, it's important these stories are told.
Absolutely. The Lion Who Never Roared, it's available through Pitch Publishing and bookshops up and down the country, I've no doubt. Ideal this sort of time, just in time for Christmas for any football fan, or anyone who's interested in the history of the game. Matt, thank you very much for your time. It's much appreciated, and I just wish you all the very best with the book and with the campaign.
Thank you so much. I've loved chatting. I love talking about it, and I really appreciate the fact that you've read the book and that you enjoyed it. I love hearing that. It makes it all worthwhile. And I hope the spirit of Jack Leslie flows through Plymouth Argyle this season. And I think that despite what happened to him, into the England team too.
Amen to that. My many thanks to Matt there, Matt Tiller. Much appreciated. The book, Jack Leslie, The Lion That Never Roared, is available at Pitch Publishing, who I'd like to thank for connecting me to Matt. You will find the book in all good bookstores, at Pitch Publishing, Amazon too. And as I mentioned, it is an ideal Christmas present, either to yourself or someone that you know. Now, you heard that Jack grew up in East London. It's not far from West Ham's old Upton Park ground. Well, a short distance from there is Canning Town. That's a little part of London. On a house there is a blue plaque that celebrates where Jack grew up. I took a trip there to have a quick look at it. You can find the photos on the Three Lions podcast social media pages. I think it's safe to say that area has changed a bit since Jack grew up. If you'd like to go and visit it, or you're in the area, head to 12 Gerald Road, Canning Town, East London. That's it for me for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you've missed any recent ones, you can tune in at your podcast provider of choice or threelionspodcast.com. There are the recent Lionesses episodes. There's the episodes for the Euro draw and a couple of Your England Journey episodes too. Plenty for you to while away some hours with. I'll be back with you soon with another episode. So until then, take care of yourselves. Cheers.